This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Richard Muller's magnum opus, his Post Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, which is now available to freely read online.
Amen. Amen. Well, I have a thought or two to maybe tickle our evening discussion with, if you're open for it. So I'm going to put a link in your chat session in this, and I think this is volume 1. You can check. Yeah, this looks to be volume 1. And so the idea, and it should be available to borrow for an hour, which is about the time we might want to just take a look at it. And what I just wanted to talk about with respect to it, first of all, was to acknowledge it is now available for loaning from the Internet Archive as a library resource. And what a wonderful thing that is. So the work that I'm referring to is Richard Muller's Post Reformation Reformed Dogmatics series, so 4 volumes. And it's a pretty exciting work in the sense that Muller might be the preeminent scholarly Reformed classical theist of our day. He is I think he's a graduate of Calvin College, and he's been a professor down at Duke University, if I'm remembering that right. I actually just checked that here.
Yeah, I think I recognize his name. I think he might teach or have taught at the Calvin Theological Center, is my recollection.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up here on Wikipedia. Got the physics professor, so that's not him. Okay, so he is where he's at. Yeah, so he got his MDiv from Union Theological Seminary and his PhD in Reformation Studies from Duke in 1976. And then maybe he went up to Calvin. Maybe that's how that happened. In any event, from the scholarly perspective, one of the most important reads, I would say, to anybody in Reformed theology who wants to really master and understand the material in that 100 to 150 to 200 year period right after the Reformation. So Muller's series is the Post-Reformation, and he defines that in terms of, I think it's 3 different eras, and it's pretty great reading. It's not, now, don't get me wrong, it's dry, so it's not just a kind of casual read. If you were looking for something to replace your John Grisham murder mystery on your next plane flight, Chuck, I don't think that would be a good substitute for it, but it is chock full of goodness about the state of the Reformation and the post-Reformation period. And that's really exciting to me because just like you and I are reading the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, if we were to read any sort of comparable or equivalent work on Calvinism or the Reformation, Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics definitely comes to mind. Vosch's Reformed Dogmatics comes to mind. And Muller's RD series here comes to mind as some of the most important seminal reads. I just wanted to bring that up, talk a little bit about why he's important, where he fits, where his scholarship is so helpful, maybe place him in the geography relative to where I am, which is a bit of a misnomer because he is the accomplished scholar and I'm Joe Average here. But I do have I fit in a different part of the Reformed categories than he does. And it's really interesting to talk about that. I'll just throw that out there. How does that sound talking about it? Do you have any sort of familiarity with his material before? Have you heard of his PRRD series at all?
I think I may have run across series just in terms of I've had an interest in reading some historical theology, and that interest has grown greatly just recently as a result of our discussion. So I know that I've done a little bit of looking what's out there in historical theology. In fact, I saw this one because I do remember a couple that were fairly in-depth, and you're noting this is a 4-volume set. No, there were a couple other ones I saw. I get the impression that there's a single volume historical theology that covers a longer era, not just post-Reformation, by Greg Allison. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That one actually was, I think it still is, on sale for only $7 if you want to get it on Kindle on Amazon. And I was trying to decide whether it was worth it for me to download it on Kindle because I'm not a big Kindle user, or whether I should think about plunking down the money for the hardcover. And I know there's at least one other one I ran into that's a historical theology rather than merely a history of Christianity. But yeah, it's of interest, and so I'd be interested in talking a little bit more about Muller and hearing your thoughts about him as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Firstly, I do have the Allison work on historical theology, and I was able to get it bundled with the first edition of Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. So I picked the two of them up for quite a deal. I think it was maybe $5 or $7 a couple of years ago. So if we ever want to go through that together, that might definitely be a worthwhile and delightful exercise. So the thing that is exciting to me about Muller is his documentation of the scholastic part of Reformed theology. And so I think there's going to be a tie-in here with the medieval period, which you and I have been studying together. And you and I have talked about the Aristotelian categories and this broad medieval classical theism that developed amongst Jewish, Islamic, as well as Christian scholars. And I think Muller fits and takes that development and moves it forward. So there was a big question at the start of the Reformation. How much of the scholastic baggage was necessary to be a part of the Christian theological enterprise? So you have the Protestant Reformation happen. And the Protestant Reformation really only happens in the context of something bigger happening, which was the invention of the printing press and movable type and the commoditization process for books. Now, we say commoditization, and of course here that means in a relative sense, because early printed books were anything but commodities in the sense that you and I might think of a commodity today. They weren't particularly common, but in comparison with handwritten transmission process that came before, it was a positive improvement. Maybe 2 orders of magnitude improvement in that first century in the availability of the Holy Scriptures. And really what this meant was the Protestant Reformation was the first, just as Aristotle was reintroduced into Western thought in the 11th and 12th century by the Islamic thinkers. We talked about Averroes yesterday, and then Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, responding to that, but still moving forward with that Aristotelian corpus. So you have this body of classical theism that they've developed. Now, as you and I were talking about, that philosophy took a big hit from the skeptical side from thinkers like William of Ockham. And there's a lot there to go through, and we won't necessarily talk about the medieval aspects of this or Occam's role in it, but just suffice to say that a lot of scholasticism still remained associated with theological inquiry and theological endeavor. And not necessarily counter to that, but what we have in the Protestant Reformation was this commoditization where the common people could read the Holy Scriptures for themselves. And it's such a commonplace thing now, Chuck, that I can't stress enough what a big deal it was to have access to the Bible. Just for the average plowman was the phrase that he could read, learn, and understand the Scriptures as much as any person. And so in that first 100 years, let's say, of the Protestant Reformation, we have this really common man movement. The Reformation would not really have been possible in a world without access to relatively cheap copies of the Scriptures and the associated writings, commentaries, sentences, other works, Plato's works, Aristotle's works. This was truly, it's called a Renaissance for a good reason. And so you have this tension in the Protestant Reformation. Very early, it had an everyman character. So the first 100 years, even though you had sharp and well-educated thinkers like Luther and Calvin, who were largely not in that scholastic tradition, but you had the feedback and the intellectual, organic thoughts of the average person reading the Scriptures for the first time in hundreds of years, if perhaps ever, in the Western cultures. And so you have this tension. The first 100 years, the Reformation was very much a common man, everyman sort of thing. But then in light of the pressure brought to bear, not everybody was happy with the Protestant Reformation. And in light of the pressures brought to bear, we have pushbacks. So we have, of course, the Counter-Reformation from the Roman Catholics. And in addition to that, we just have the general availability of classical theism in the institutes of higher learning, in the cultured centers, in the sophisticated towns and cities. And so into that, we see that the Reformation starts to change in character as the classical theism, or as it was called back then more commonly, perhaps, scholasticism, came to dominate or move in, let's say, into this populist movement. And so that's where Muller's coming in when he gives us this study of Protestant scholasticism. Now, he's a scholastic, he's a classical theist, and he writes as an advocate for it very well, but he also he's not particularly partisan with his classical theism. He's valuable to read because he really does seem to try to give a fair reading and a fair representation to all the voices that are participating on their own terms. And as you know, Chuck, that's an unusual thing in theology, a mark of high scholarship. And so it's very commendable. And so that's the outline and overview.